Good morning and welcome to this message. Today I'm beginning a new series called Surviving Storms, and I hope that this series will help you survive the storms that you face in life. Maybe you're in a storm at the moment, or maybe there's a storm around the corner that you don't yet know about. But I hope that this message and this series will be helpful to you and will help you survive, not only survive, but to thrive in storms that you face in life. I faced a storm once when I was a teenager with my family. We were on a summer holiday. We were camping in North Wales on the Llyn Peninsula, right out in the northwest tip of Wales. And we had found this fantastic spot. My dad used to enjoy looking for dramatic campsites with great views. And we were on a cliff edge, on a campsite on a cliff in North Wales, with a fantastic view out across the Irish Sea. And once during this August summer holiday, we had a weather warning coming that there was a storm on the horizon. And I'd like to share with you some experiences or lessons I've learned from storms from my experience of camping in August in North Wales. Now you may be listening and watching to this message thinking, well, if you're going to camp in Wales in August, then storms are inevitable. And you're right. Storms are part of life, aren't they? They're inevitable in this summer holiday. But first, my observations of storms from that experience are that storms are unpredictable. You know, we were camping, we were enjoying the great weather in fantastic scenery, and the weather forecast came in that a storm was on the way. It came across the radio. Storms are unpredictable. They were giving an idea of the strength of the wind, of gale force winds. They were warning us to take precautions, but they couldn't be 100% sure. Storms are unpredictable. Another lesson that I learned from another observation of storms is that the storm was inevitable. It was going to hit. We were given warning and we were told it is going to hit and people need to prepare. I remember my dad going around putting in extra tent pegs around the tents. I was in my early to mid-teens at the time. I had my own tent. We had our own little encampment. I was one of 5, so we had a number of tents around with my brothers and sisters. And we all took precautions and checked our guy ropes and put extra tent pegs in. But the storm hit that night and we went to bed. We could see the clouds building up on the horizon. And we went to bed with a little bit of anxiety, thinking and bracing ourselves for a rough night. And the storm hit. And another observation of storms is that they're powerful. This storm came in from the sea. The winds hit and it was violent. And being under canvas in a storm like that was quite an experience for a young teenager. I remember lying in bed at night and the canvas of my little dome tent pressing against my face. I was scared. I'm not afraid to admit it to you. I was scared that night as this wind, this gale force wind came and racing across the sea and straight across the cliff to where we were camped. It was awesome. That's one word for it. It was frightening. Storms are powerful. This gale force wind, we've got Beaufort scales, we've got units of measure to help us understand the strength of storms that we face. We've got the Richter scale for earthquakes. Storms are powerful, and these measurements give us an idea of the intensity and the strength of storms. But this storm was powerful. It felt relentless. It was persistent in its power too. That's another lesson about storms. Storms are powerful and they're persistent. This storm, these hours, this was the longest night that I've ever experienced. This gale force wind, it didn't stop. It lasted all night, and I remember it being the long night. I remember calling out to my siblings in other tents saying, "Are you all right? How are you doing? Are you still there? Have you been blown away?" It was an experience that stays with me even today. Storms are powerful and they're persistent. Storms are frightening. As I mentioned, I remember lying in my sleeping bag thinking, this tent is going at any minute and I'm going with it, or this tent is going to get ripped away. and leave me exposed. I was scared. I couldn't wait for the morning to come. And when morning came, I emerged from my tent. It had survived. It was little. It was sheltered. But I remember our family trailer tent, which we had grown up camping in when we were little. The front of it was completely shredded. All the poles were twisted and bent. The canvas was ripped. It looked like it had collapsed at the front where the wind had hit it. And I remember it was a scene of devastation. Our camping kit was ruined. And for a family of young and teenage children, it wasn't a happy scene. And we retreated to a hotel for the day for a cooked breakfast and to warm up, and then we went back to the campsite and tidied up the mess. But I learnt a few lessons about storms that night, and that was a very vivid experience for me, where I learnt a few things about storms which I share with you now. And we all face storms in life, not only storms of nature when we're out maybe walking or camping or on holiday, or we've been caught in a storm or a gale or something like that. But we face other kinds of storms in life, don't we? Storms within our hearts, storms within our souls, storms which rage within us, things we experience that cause disquiet and cause worry and concern. We have all faced a huge storm over the last year and a half with this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic. This storm has been raging around the world. It's still raging. It's not over yet. We're through the worst of it, it would seem at the moment, although I'm mindful and I'm aware, as I'm sure you are, that there's concerns about variants, the Delta variant, and what happens next. The vaccination program is helping our country, but this storm is raging around the world still. It's a storm that we've all experienced, and maybe you've experienced the COVID storm close to home with the loss of someone close to you. Maybe you're bereaved. Maybe you have suffered COVID. You have experienced this awful disease and you are living with the effects of it. This COVID storm, this pandemic, has been raging and is still raging, and its effects are far and wide-ranging and far-reaching. But not only with COVID, we face other kinds of storms in life, relational storms, where there is tension and strife in relationships that we have, maybe in marriages or in families or amongst friends or amongst work colleagues. Maybe we face storms of persecution where we suffer for our faith. And maybe that's a storm that you're experiencing at the moment. We face economic storms, don't we? Storms of financial pressure or concern. Again, this is a legacy of COVID and the pandemic, where economies have suffered, people's personal situations, job employment and job security is under threat for some. We face all kinds of storms in life. How do we survive these storms? How do we survive? How is it even possible we can't even contemplate thriving. We just want to survive these storms. When I was in that tent in North Wales, I wasn't thinking about thriving in that situation. It was a case of just get through the night. How is it possible to survive in a storm? Well, Jesus in his teaching gives us some great help with a parable he tells of a story of two men who were building. One he described as wise and one he described as foolish. And the key to this story is about having firm foundations. And Jesus teaches about the importance about having a firm foundation in life. And Jesus says that if we make him our firm foundation, then we will survive any storm that strikes. We will be able to withstand the onslaught of the elements and survive. And Jesus tells this parable in Matthew chapter 7 and also repeats it in Luke. It's recorded as well in Luke chapter 6. In Matthew 7, Jesus says this: "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." Jesus here is saying that there are two ways of building in life. You either build on the rock or you build on the sand. There's no in between. There's two builders. There's not three, there's not four, there's two. And one builds on rock and one builds on sand. The commentator from a few centuries ago, Matthew Henry, he was commentating on this passage, and he said simply, "Everything besides Christ is sand." And that's something for us to think about today. Are there areas in our life where we're building and we're not building on Jesus? Is Jesus the rock? Jesus describes himself as the rock. He is a firm foundation on which we can build our lives. And if we build our lives on Jesus, it's like we're building on the rock. One with a firm foundation, able to survive every storm. Building on the rock is harder work and it takes longer, but it's worth it. You know, these two houses that were built, they look the same from a distance. They had the same appearance. One went up quickly on sand. To build on rock, you have to dig down deep. That's what the story describes in Luke chapter 6. The builder digs down deep and lays his foundation on the rock. It takes time to lay foundations. If you look at any construction site, when you're passing in the city, you'll see buildings going up, and the amount of time it takes for the unseen work to happen. It takes time to lay a solid foundation. You have to dig down deep and lay the trenches right and get the levels right and make sure everything's correct before the structure goes up. And Jesus is saying here that if you build on rock, if you take time to build your life on me, on my words and my principles, then you will survive the storm. I'd just like to share with you three simple observations from what Jesus is saying here to help us build our lives on rock, build our lives on Jesus. The first one is this. And if I go to Luke chapter 6 and Luke's account of this passage, of this parable, Luke says this in verse 47. He records Jesus is saying this: "I will show you what he is like who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice. He is like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. And when the flood came, the torrent struck that house but could not shake it because it was well built." Three simple steps to surviving the storm are this. Firstly, come to Jesus. Jesus says, "Come to me. Come to me." He extends an invitation this morning for us to come close to him. It takes courage to approach. It takes courage to come close to Jesus. It takes a sense of submission and surrender and humility to come to Jesus. I would encourage you to take some courage today, to demonstrate some humility and respond to the invitation to come to him. We have the opportunity, each one of us, to draw close to him. Now, it doesn't matter if you've never done this before, or whether you're doing this for the first time, or whether you're responding frequently to the invitation to come, but every day Jesus wants us to draw close to him. And there is no obstacle so great, or any problem or mistake so big that prevents us from coming close, Jesus extends the invitation this morning to you to come to him. And so that's my first challenge for you, to start building your life on a rock, to survive the storms that life throws at us, to thrive, not only survive. The first step is for us to come close to Jesus, to draw close to him, to come with an attitude of humility and thankfulness and expectation. Because in that presence, in his presence, when we are close to him, when we draw near to him, where we open up our hearts and say, here I am, Lord, I'm coming close. I'm putting down my agendas, my priorities, the things that I'm doing at the moment, I'm putting them to one side and I'm taking a moment to come close to you. In that moment of intimacy and submission, Jesus speaks. And that's the second observation. Jesus says that those who come to him and hear his words. You know, when we're close to Jesus, when we cut out all the noise, the background noise, the busyness of life and lay our schedules down, when we put aside our agendas and our priorities and submit and come to him, we have an opportunity to hear his words, to hear the beauty of his voice and hear him speaking to us. Words that encourage and build up, and words of grace, words of acceptance and affirmation. Words that heal. You know, when Jesus speaks, everything changes. It's an amazing thought, isn't it, that God is speaking today. How does he speak to us? He speaks through his word. You know, as you come to Jesus, as you put him first, as you create space in your life for him, he will speak to you. And he will speak to you primarily through his Bible. So it's important that we read our Bibles and that we ask God to speak to us by his Spirit as we read. But he speaks to us through our relationships with our fellow believers, with our church. He speaks to us through dreams and visions, and by his Spirit. He speaks to us through wise counsel from godly men and women, from our brothers and sisters in Christ. He can speak through them to us. His primary way of speaking to us is through his word. So it's important that we read his word regularly and take it on board. So as we come to him and hear his words, the third area to help us lay a firm foundation, the first one is come to him. The second one is take time to listen and to hear his words. And thirdly, the toughest one of all, is to put it into practice. You know, that's the only distinguishing feature between the wise builder and the foolish builder, is that they both came to Jesus. They both heard his words, but only the wise man put them into practice. You know, the houses looked the same until the storm struck. The wise man put Jesus' words into practice. In other words, he dug down deep and laid his foundation on rock. He came to Jesus, he heard his words, and he put them into practice. You know, we need to apply what Jesus is saying to us. Because if it stays theory, if it stays unapplied, we're not demonstrating faith or trust in him. But if we listen to Jesus' words and apply them to our lives, it will be like building on rock. The storms will still come in life, don't get me wrong. We're not immune to the storms just because we're God's children and we're saved and building on the rock, protected by him. We're not immune to the storms, but the promise is that we will survive the storms. As we continue to build our lives on rock, we will survive the storms. So moving forward over the next few weeks, I'd like to finish with this observation that Jesus shared this parable at the end of his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6 and chapter 7. When Jesus says, "These words of mine," he's talking about his Sermon on the Mount, which he gave to his believers, his disciples who were gathered listening to him teach on that mountainside. And Jesus gave them some principles, some biblical principles for life, some kingdom principles, some fundamentals of his kingdom. And I'd like to look at these over the coming weeks to help us continue to build our lives on the firm foundation, on the rock that is his word, and apply his teaching to our lives. Because as we move out of this pandemic and as we're in this phase of recovery and restarting life, as it were, returning to normality, let's make sure that we build our lives in this new era post-COVID on Jesus' teachings. Because storms will come again. There will be other storms in life. And I'd love you to be able to survive those. So let's all build on the rock. Let's go on a journey together over the coming weeks. Let's lay firm foundations for life and build strong, trusting in Jesus. Thank you for watching. God bless.